Hello everybody, and thank you for joining us today for the Primary Schools Author event with the incredible children's author Gail Carson Levine. We're going to have some readings by Gail and also a conversation with her and learn a bit more about her writing. Gail grew up in New York. She is a best-selling, award-winning author who has written many books for children, including her first book, Ella Enchanted. Gail's favourite book growing up was Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie, and we're lucky enough today to be hearing an extract from her book, which was inspired by the fairies from Peter Pan, and that book is called Fairy Dust and the Quest for the Egg. So here is a reading from Gail of that book.
Hello, I'm Gail Carson Levine, and I'd like to welcome you to the 2020 Digital Bradford Literature Schools program. I'm going to read to you from Fairy Dust and the Quest for the Egg, which I wrote and which is about the fairies of Peter Pan's Neverland. The part that I'm going to read to you is from the beginning of chapter 2. Mother Dove knew the instant Prilla arrived. "The new fairies come," she told Beck excitedly. "Isn't that wonderful?" "It is," Beck said, hoping the newcomer was an animal talent fairy. In the courtyard, a crowd gathered around Prilla. A message talent fairy flew off to tell the queen. Terence, a fairy dust talent sparrow man, sprinkled a level teacup of fairy dust on Prilla. Not a particle more than a cup, nor a particle less, mind you. It was Prilla's first daily allotment. As soon as the dust touched her, a tingly feeling spread over her, and her glow began. Fairies glow lemon yellow, edged with gold. She sat up. Her bent wings sprang back, and her wings started to flutter. Her mind cleared. She was a fairy, a never fairy. She was so lucky. The other fairies waited, feeling too solemn even to smile at the new arrival. Each fairy hoped against hope for a new talent member. They expected her to announce her talent. The first act of every new fairy was to make the announcement. But Prilla flew over the courtyard, her brown hair streaming out behind her. Flying was marvelous. She turned an aerial cartwheel, and she had magical powers, didn't she? She flew to the home tree and shook a little fairy dust off her hand and onto a leaf. She squinted hard at the leaf, and it flickered out of sight. She blinked, and there it was again. The fairies on the ground stared up at her. Not one of them had ever seen an arrival behave as Prilla was behaving. She landed in their midst, between Terence and a caterpillar herder. They drew back. "Greetings," she said. "I'm so glad to be a fairy. Thank you for having me." Several fairies raised their eyebrows. Did this newcomer think they picked her? Prilla saw their expressions and faltered. I'll try to be a good fairy." A fairy said, "My, she's freckled." Terence said, "Pleasantly plump, though." These were the sort of things one said at an arrival, ordinarily after the new fairy had announced her talent. "I swear they look younger every year," the caterpillar herder said. A few fairies nodded. "Prilla wouldn't look young to you. She'd look grown up, just about 5 inches tall, same as any other fairy, and perfectly proportioned." Fairies, however, knew that Prilla was a youngster, because her nose and the lower halves of her wings hadn't yet reached their full growth. A grown-up clumsy wouldn't see Prilla at all. He might see the air shimmer. He might smell cinnamon. He might hear leaves rustle, but he'd have no idea he was in the presence of a fairy. Adult clumsies can't see or hear never fairies, although they can feel them. If a fairy pinches a grown-up clumsy, The clumsy will slap the spot, thinking he's been bitten by a mosquito. Tinkerbell landed in the courtyard. When she'd seen Prilla flash by her workshop window, she had dropped her leaky ladle and come. She wanted to be on the spot if the new fairy turned out to have a talent for repairing pots and pans. Terence smiled his most charming smile at Tink. He admired her enormously. He liked her bounce when she landed. He liked the arch of her eyebrows, the curl to her ponytail, and her bangs, which were the perfect length, whatever length they were. He even liked her scowl, which was both fierce and pert. Tink ignored the smile. Her heart had been broken once, and she wasn't going to endanger it again. "Welcome to Fairy Haven," she told Prilla. "What's your name, child?" "Prilla." Prilla held out her hand to shake. Tink hesitated, then shook. Fairies didn't usually shake hands. "I'm Tinkerbell." That's from the beginning of Fairy Dust and the Quest for the Egg.
Gail, thank you so much for reading for us from your book, Fairy Dust and the Quest for the Egg. It's obvious from your reading how much you love fairies and magic, and I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about your book.
When I was little, I adored Peter Pan. And when the people at Disney came to me and asked me to write a book about the fairies of Neverland, I thought that was a great opportunity. And then I started to think about the Peter Pan and how I could work another universe into his world and still respect it. And but Tinkerbell in Peter Pan is very rude. So I had to change her a little bit and introduce a lot of new fairies. And then I had the idea that the fairies would each have talent. And so their magic is mostly around their talent. If you remember, there's the water talent fairy, Ronnie, who can reach into a tub of water and pull out a handful of water, which is something no human, or as they call us, clumsy, can do. And when we meet her, she takes that clump of water and shapes it into a glistening water fish. And then she balls it up again and starts bouncing it, and the water bounces and rises back to her hand. And that's just a lot of fun. And then I made up Mother Dove, who's the reason that the island is magical. I had just a great time writing the 3 books that I wrote for Disney.
And something else that was really clear listening to your reading there, and also reading the book, is that that you love Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie, and about what drew you to the book when you were a child.
Well, my parents were great about making sure we had reading, and I fell in love with Peter. I wanted to marry Peter. I thought Wendy was an idiot for going home. And one of the things that I loved about Peter is that it's not just that he's brave, it's that he goes against what people want him to do, what people expect him to do. And I was a pretty obedient kid. So watching Peter do all those things that I wouldn't have dared to do, I just loved. And I read Peter Pan again and again and again and again. And I think there are probably parts of it that I have memorized.
And also in your book, Fairy Dust and the Quest for the Egg, we touched a little bit on some of the fairies there. We've got Tinkerbell, who everybody will recognise, and Prilla, who's the new fairy, and a host of others. But they're really interesting, these fairies, because sometimes we perhaps think of fairies as being a bit sweet and glittery, but these fairies have a lot of power, and they go on these amazing quests. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about your inspiration behind the fairies.
Well, their power, almost all of it, comes from fairy dust. as in Peter Pan, one of the things that I have to do as a writer who writes about fairies is to limit their power. So if you're a water talent fairy, you can do a lot with water, but you can't do a lot with wood. So there's the power, but it's limited power, and which I'm always aware of when I use magic, because we never want the magic to solve the problems. And so the magic can't just go in and save Mother Dove, who's in danger. The magic can't do anything about the dragon. The magic can't make the mermaids do what the fairies like. So it's power, but it's limited power. But it's also fun to be able to imagine doing things that you and I can't do in ordinary life.
They are great fun, and when I was reading the book, I loved all the different talents that the fairies have. Did you have a lot of fun thinking about what those talents would be?
Yeah, I mean, whenever the story needed a talent, I came up with one to solve the problem. Yeah, there's dust talent fairies who are very good at making fairy dust. One of the characters is a speed talent fairy. So she and other speed talent fairies can fly faster than anyone else. And then the whole business with the wings, I had to make up rules about the wings to fit the plot. And then in the next books, I was stuck with those rules, whether they worked or not. So, you set up limitations as you write, as well as creating things that unleash possibilities. They unleash possibilities and create limits.
Fantastic. And of course, this isn't your only series of books. You've written a number of books for children, and they cover a wide variety of subjects. And I just wondered whether we could talk about some of your other books, like Ella Enchanted, for example, and what inspired you to write them.
Well, Ella was my first published book, and I was taking a writing class, and I didn't know what to write. And I had just read a wonderful book by Robin McKinley called Beauty, and it was a retelling of Beauty and the Beast. So I thought, well, maybe I can retell a fairy tale. And I looked around and thought, well, what are important fairy tales? And Cinderella is a very important one. So I thought, well, maybe I can do Cinderella. So when I went back to the Grimm version, the Brothers Grimm, I looked at it, and Cinderella is so sweet. The stepsisters and the stepmother are mean, and she's always sweet to them. And I thought she was disgustingly sweet, and I didn't like her. And I didn't understand why she did whatever she's told. So it's hard to write about a character that you don't like and you don't understand. So I was in trouble for a while. And then I came up with the dreadful fairy Lucinda and the curse of obedience that she gives Ella. And then I got Ella. Then she's not disgustingly sweet. She does what she's told because she has to. And as much as she can, she tries not to. And that was the beginning of Ella Enchanted. And then I was on a roll, and I started to look around for other fairy tales. I had written a picture book about a fairy tale called Toads and Diamonds. And that became the first of my princess tales, which were also published in England. And I think as spinning tales. So that was the first, and I wrote 5 more of those. And then I went on to do my own version of Snow White and Rapunzel. And so recently my 25th book, Kids, came out. And they're not all fairy tales.
Oh, that's an amazing achievement to have written so many books. I wonder, because we've touched on the fact that you had a childhood love of Peter Pan, and that was a book you enjoyed when you were a child. What other 3 books would you recommend that were childhood favourites of yours that our listeners and watchers might not have read perhaps before?
Well, you might have noticed I'm old. And a lot of the great books that kids are reading today didn't exist when I was a kid. So I read classics. If kids don't know Anne of Green Gables, I would say that's one that holds up. But I read the books by Louisa May Alcott, and I'm not sure how well they hold up today. Heidi, Bambi, Black Beauty, which is English, and if kids are interested, resulted in reforms of the treatment of horses in England after she wrote that book, almost immediately after she wrote that book. So that might be one that kids would fall in love with.
Oh, some excellent books there. Some of my favourites as well, I think.
Ah,
I think I read somewhere as well that you were a bit of a Mark Twain fan. Is that
oh, I
true?
love Mark Twain. And one that I adore, even though it's kind of sad, is King Arthur is a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court. And I love Twain's sense of humor. So it's a very, very funny book commenting on kind of an imagined version of the Middle Ages, but it's very funny. And it's very deep in terms of feeling. That's probably my favorite book by Twain. So you've done a lot of homework on me.
Well, you are very, very fascinating, I have to say. So it was a pleasure to do, and I've been enjoying reading your books this week and reading them with my son as well. So that's been great fun. He loves them. I wondered as well. I mean, we may have some budding writers watching us and thinking that they would also like to write their own book and have a go, or they may already be writing. Have you got any tips for them that you could maybe get them started?
Well, I have two books full of tips. One is called Writing Magic, and the other is Writer to Writer. And I would suggest that they start with Writing Magic. And they're both how-to books for kids about writing. But in terms of like two bits of ideas, things to think about, is one that the quality that a writer needs the most is patience, because writing is slow. And learning to write is also slow, and writers learn to write their whole lives. And the other is not to be very critical of one's work. It's not helpful to think this is bad, this stinks. It just makes it harder to write. So it's helpful to just do it and not think much about quality. Just think about writing and telling a story that interests you. And if it interests you, it's very likely to interest other people.
Fantastic. And I do have one other thing that I'm a bit curious about after our discussion, because one of the things I love your reading is hearing the fairies' names. So Tinkerbell is already a pleasing name that we all know, but Prilla and Rani and Vidya, they're all really beautiful names. How did you come up with the names for the other fairies?
Well, Rani is my sister's name, and it's also an anagram of rain, and she's a water talent fairy. So that one was pretty easy. I'm not sure where I got Prilla from, but I love it. I love that name for a main character. Vidya is, Disney was very interested in the names, and they wanted the character to be called Invidia. And that was a little too much on the nose for me. So I shortened it to Vidya. I'm trying to remember some of the other names. Beck is an animal talent fairy, if I remember right. And I think that was just like, it sounded a little like beak, like a bird's beak. So I got to Beck. And since Barry was British, I wanted to have a little bit of English flavor. So I flatter myself that the names are congenial to a British reader. So I hope that's true.
I think that's definitely true because I love reading your books out loud as well. There's a really beautiful quality, so you can enjoy them whether you're reading them in your head scrolled away in a corner or whether you're sort of hearing them out loud. Is that a way that you write? Do you Do you write and edit by reading aloud, or?
No, I don't. But before I wrote this, I went back to Peter Pan and I read it again, even though I knew it so well. I read it again, paying attention to the way Barry wrote. And Barry, if one studies him, is amazing. The cadences and the way he can manage to change the subject 4 times within a single sentence. And I wasn't able to really duplicate his voice. One of the things I noticed was that he used of course a lot. So I sprinkled in of course all over the place. And as I wrote, I tried to get as close as I could to Barry. Um, knowing that that was flawed, knowing that, if Barry was alive, he, might have a lot of objections, and dead, he might be spinning in his grave, but that's what I had in mind.
I think you really got the spirit of the book across, because both books are very funny and very playful, and, if you don't mind me saying, a bit cheeky in places. And I think you get that across. Did you enjoy writing the books for that reason?
I enjoyed writing the first 2 very much. I had trouble with the third. And when a book gives me trouble, it becomes less fun. But I'm happy about all 3.
Well, it seems only right that a book about Tinkerbell and Peter Pan and Netherland should be a little bit of a cheeky book and cause you a few problems. So the books are saying. Excellent. Well, I'm hoping that we might be able to hear a little bit of Peter Pan from you, J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan. Would you mind reading a little bit of that for us as well?
Not at all.
Thank you. It's been wonderful to learn more about your work. Thank you very much, Gail.
Thank you. And I hope the kids enjoy the festival.